Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all for joining our discussion of a topic that affects several of our communities, resisting racist policing in all its forms. This is the 13th episode of our weekly webinar series. Once again, my name is Lina Al-Arian and I'm Executive Director of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. Our mission is to defend civil liberties and freedoms, promote a fair US criminal justice system, and advocate for the rights of political prisoners targeted in the war on terror. You can find all of our previous webinars in the video section of our Facebook page or on our Civil Freedoms YouTube channel where you can subscribe. As part of our Injustice at Home series, topics range from the COVID-19 crisis in federal prisons and the Holy Land Foundation 5 to the criminalization of mental health and updates on our coronavirus prisoner release project. Of course, we were thrilled to hear the wonderful news of Sheikh Ali Tamimi's ordered release after 15 years of incarceration under SAMs or special administrative measures. We will continue to monitor his case and provide updates as it proceeds. Of course, he's challenging his conviction and life sentence. Our webinar Friday at the same time, 2:30 p.m. Eastern, will be co-sponsored by our coalition member, the Afia Foundation, to discuss the horrific and tragic case of Dr. Afia Siddiqui. For more than a decade, Dr. Afia has been serving an unjust 86-year sentence at FMC Carswell, where coronavirus cases have been high and where there have been 5 COVID-related inmate deaths. Joining us will be her sister from Pakistan, Dr. Fawzia Siddiqui, my father, Ariane from Istanbul, and of course, the longtime champion of her cause in the US, Haj Mori Salah Khan. Today, I'm very honored and pleased to introduce our 3 guests, academics who are dedicating their lives through scholarly research and advocacy to empower Muslims in the US and the UK, and to challenge national security policies that criminalize and target our communities. In light of the recent uprising following the racist police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, calls to defund the police have entered the mainstream, with many abolitionists seeking alternative models that rely on a community-wide approach which combines local institutions, mental health, and other services to inform on potential threats in order to preempt or prevent crime. In August 12th, op-ed published in Al Jazeera English entitled "Community Policing Already Exists and It's Dangerous," warned of the dangers of previously implemented so-called community policing models in the form of CVE or countering violent extremism, modeled after the UK program Prevent, that have resulted in the dangerous criminalization of speech and thought and ultimately led to political repression. Discussing this issue and its themes today are its 2 authors, Paula Thompson and Muniza Rizvi, who are setting the example, mashallah, for aspirational mother and daughter-in-law relationships. Paula Thompson is a PhD student in historical and cultural studies of religion with a focus on Islamic studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Her research centers on the war on terror, Islam, countering violent extremism. Muniza Rizvi is a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of California, Davis. Her research, supported by the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, the Social Science Research Council, examines intra-Muslim moral disputation and securitization in Britain. Hosting and leading the conversation is our dear friend and brother, Dr. Asim Qureshi, who serves as the research director at the advocacy group CAGE in the UK. Dr. Asim graduated in law, specializing in international law and in Islamic law. He completed his PhD in international conflict analysis from the University of Kent. He is also the author of Rules of the Game, Detention, Deportation, Disappearance, A Virtue of Disobedience, in the forthcoming I Refuse to Condemn, Resisting Racism in Times of National Security. Since 2010, he has been advising legal teams involved in defending terrorism trials in the US and at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Thank you so much to the 3 of you, and Dr. Asim, I'm very glad to turn it over to you.
Thank you for having us, Lena. Thanks. Hi, everyone.
It's my pleasure. Thank you all for joining us. Bye.
Bismillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's my honor and immense privilege to be hosting this discussion with two people I consider my teachers on CVE in America, and also on kind of policing and race relations in America. Like, these guys, mashallah, their level of knowledge and understanding of what is taking place there right now is really helping those of us, especially who can't be present over there, to understand exactly what's going on, but also how to effectively campaign and deal with it too. So, we're very, very privileged this evening to be able to host this discussion. For me, as a long-time supporter of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, it's an immense honor to be hosting that discussion on their platform. It's an organization that my own Cage heavily supports, and I hope that all of you listening to this will continue to support their work, especially those of you who are in the States. They need funding, they need as much support and help as they can in order to carry out the very essential work that they do. So I want to get into this conversation because we only have a limited time, and I really want to hear from our two speakers as much as possible. But just to kind of preface the discussion, we all want to stay safe, right? This is something that is a basic human need, the desire to live safe and happy lives. And the question about how we attain that is inextricably linked to this conversation. Because often we're told that in order to have that safety, in order to have that security, we require a policing model to obtain that. Because that's ultimately, when we're talking about the police, and we're talking about policing in general, that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to understand, how we remain safe in our daily lives. So that brings in all sorts of other questions about how society structures itself, what crime is, what the extent of crime is, what the root causes of crime are, but also, how we as individuals respond to what's going on in society, to how we see others, how we see different communities, people that we're fed a narrative about, kind of fearing. So that, I think, really, when we're thinking about what Muniz and Paula are going to teach us about today, I think that's really something that we have to keep in the back of our minds, that's the ultimate question that we're trying to answer here. Because, as we've seen here in the UK, which is a context I'm much more familiar with than the US, we start off with a racist police system that is institutionally racist. And then on top of that, what we do is we add fear through the war on terror. And so we add this whole other kind of structure of securitization, of building suspect communities on top of a system and a structure that had already prejudicial views towards certain communities, right? Then what we do is we say, okay, well, structure of securitization, policing isn't enough, and hard laws aren't enough. What we need to do is we need to turn the whole of society into playing this role of policing. So lecturers, teachers, doctors start acting like border agents, as just one example. If you look at the immigration system that we have. And so what we have, what emerges is this very holistic sense of policing that isn't just restricted to the police. Now, what impact does that have on society? And that's what we're going to discuss today. And so I'm going to start off by simply, asking our speakers about what the culture of policing in the US actually is. Let's start from there, and then we'll move on to understanding how CVE relates to that then. So perhaps, sorry, maybe Muniza, you could start with that one first, inshallah.
Sure, that's no problem. So there have been a number of very important articles and essays recently, one in particular by the sort of renowned abolitionist Mariam Kaba. And she makes the point that there's never been a time in the entire history of the United States in which the police was not essentially and fundamentally about violence against the dispossessed, particularly Black people. Whether we're talking about sort of proto-policing formations in the South in the 17 and 1800s, which were about the management and capture of the enslaved, or later on in the North in the mid-1800s, when the police were quashing labor struggles led by poor people. We can see that there's sort of this continuity. So the function of the police, before anything else, is to protect the status quo, to protect capital, and pressing the knee into a Black man's neck until he dies is part of that work and necessary to that work. But more specifically on the topic of the culture of police departments, there's a culture of impunity in which, you know, even the so-called good apples are systematically weeded out and punished through different institutionalized and also informal methods, right? You either adapt to, you know, violent, racist police culture and champion the blue wall of silence when you see your colleagues err, or you're kind of an outsider who doesn't progress within the department. So policing is structured around people efficiently carrying out tasks, not questioning what's assigned to them. It's about obeying rules in the way many other modern institutions are, and they're quite resistant to change.
From my perspective, I like a theorist named Mark Neocleous, and he argues for an expanded concept of police, which include a variety of institutions which come to not only reproduce order, as Muniza was discussing, but also help to create the fabrication to protect the social order that is related to capitalism, or the capitalist social order. And I think beyond institutions, when we speak about CVE and the things that we have come to today, we can think of the way civil society, as you mentioned, tech companies, educators, universities, even corporations are incorporated into this whole broad policing system, all the way down to maybe the prototypes we see now as Karen, your everyday, you know, white woman in middle-class suburbia.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Actually, kind of, as Muniza was speaking, the line that KRS-One says of like officer, overseer, keep on kind of interpolating the two words kind of came at me straight away, because, you know, there is that feeling constantly that nothing has changed, right? But in many ways things have. And I guess what you know, maybe Paula, you can start with this time. What I want to understand is, okay, we've got this very militarized policing in the US, and there is a ubiquity to it, that it's present almost in every single aspect of life. You read Alex Vitale's book, The End of Policing, you see, which you both cite, of course, in your essay, you see that even within schools, you have actual police officers. So the question is, I mean, why move towards a CVE system? Because, you know, it's not like there isn't complete policing in every single aspect of US life already. So where does this come from, and why is it even needed?
Well, I mean, I feel like educators in the US, they gave a response, actually a union, a teachers union, to the FBI's Don't Be a Puppet website that was teaching children how to pick out terrorists among them. And the teachers had written, we don't think our job is to target children. We're not helping them or harming them. And so I don't think teachers saw themselves as police until they were called upon to do these duties. And they were very alarmed by it and the damage that it caused. And so as you said, we do have police officers in the city, I'm sorry, in the schools to feed that school to prison pipeline. But I don't know that. So I would say teachers directly play a part, because they would target a child as a problem child, right, and send them to the office, or they would be the one to send them to the principal or the primary contact that would have the child be in contact with the police. But I don't think that until this CVE in the schools, and I think the FBI released a CVE in school document, maybe it was around 2016, 2017 as well. I don't think they saw themselves as actively in this role as when countering violent extremism came out and was actually calling upon them to do these kinds of roles. Other than that, I don't think there has been much information here, like in the UK, on teachers referring, but I don't know. I just know that maybe the research hasn't been done yet to put these cases out there.
Muniz, do you want to add anything to that?
Apologies, I'm having some minor technical issues on my end. Yeah, so as far as the the question of distributing or dispersing policing tasks, we've seen coalitions like the Movement for Black Lives champion this kind of invest, divest framework, which is about divesting from institutions that criminalize and harm Black people, and instead investing in things like education, health, and safety. And I think our main intervention with this article was to ask, what exactly does that mean? We have to be precise when we, articulate these kinds of often policy changes. Does this mean simply transforming the public sector into the police, or does it mean something else? And as my mother-in-law mentioned earlier, there has been pushback, not only by teachers, but also increasingly social workers and mental health providers who don't want to become surrogates for the police. And recently, I've seen a lot of commentators who are trying to portray themselves as kind of offering practical solutions, suggest that there do exist precedents like Britain, in which there are far less armed police officers, and suggesting that we should emulate the model of Britain. But as we showed in the article, in the UK, the public sector has been deputized in a way, or to an extent, that we don't necessarily see in the United States. So when we call for the abolition of the police, for example, we have to be sure that we're not in the process instituting sort of new forms of social control that ultimately, widen the scope of law enforcement, but appear, to be doing otherwise.
Sure. I mean, you've actually spent a fair bit of time in the UK studying these issues. I think you've looked at a number of prevent cases. I think maybe for a US audience, it might be useful if you could maybe share some examples of how prevent operates and how that links potentially to what's going on in the US too.
Right. So in the article, we mentioned that in the US, for example, we've seen how material support for terrorism charges can transform beliefs into crimes. And we cited the case of Ali al-Tamimi, who, alhamdulillah, was released from prison very recently after the article actually came out. But despite this fact, and we've also seen cases like Illinois' CVE program, there was an interest in exploring how mental health providers or teachers or religious figures could play a more active role in countering extremism. But bracketing that, we don't see public sector policing as a legal duty in the way we do in the UK. So in the UK in 2015, the teachers, one's colleagues potentially, doctors, they were all deputized. So we have situations where a Muslim man might go to his general practitioner about an injury and be questioned about the Islamic State. And we mentioned another example of someone who mentioned their participation in climate protests, and then they were later visited by counterterrorism police. So we, in the US at least, we haven't reached this stage where this form of public sector policing is so institutionalized.
And kind of staying on the theme, Paula, of the way in which the US has learnt from the UK or Europe more generally, I'm actually quite interested in your research, because you actually look at the way that some of these kind of think tanks and policy outfits cooperate and kind of use a certain best practice of CVE to bring certain practices into the US. And I'm thinking here specifically of kind of groups like the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. So could you tell us a little bit more about how this sharing of practice works between the two, please?
Unmute my mic. Yes, so hold on one second. Something's coming up on my screen. So in 2015, Attorney General Loretta Lynch announced the launch of a Strong Cities Network at the United Nations General Assembly. And it was basically created to connect municipal leaders and facilitate information sharing, as well as training and best practices across a global network of mayors, policymakers, and practitioners about countering violent extremism in all of its forms. There are Arab countries involved, African countries involved, also various cities and municipalities in the United States and Europe. And it does build on that idea that local communities are uniquely placed to counter violent extremism and create stronger and safer cities, right? That the communities have this inside knowledge, I guess, which again reaches the deputization out into these groups beyond basically the police and other entities. It also was launched and developed with seed funding provided by the US Department of State. And it has moved on to seek private sector support. However, there's not a lot available on this. It's also driven by an international steering committee, originally of 26 cities and municipalities, as I said, from different cities across the globe. Interestingly, Minnesota, Minneapolis was one of those cities on the steering committee. And so that adds another reason why I felt when it was important to write the article, when we could see how violence and violence prevention, progression of violence and violence prevention, and how moving forward to defund the police and these calls were very CVE-like and moving in a very CVE manner, because we had the US Department of State investment within Minneapolis and within the Somali community, including an exchange program between Somali officers and officers there, and sending also some military equipment. There's an article I'll be happy to link afterward for people to read on that. Also, Minneapolis/St. Paul being part of the original 3 pilot cities targeted by the Obama administration for CVE, and also having Keith Ellison at the helm driving this kind of defund movement and moving forward in the city when, as an attorney general, when he, as a congressman, was involved in countering violent extremism in many ways. Also at the summit, a Countering Violent Extremism Summit in 2015, he also spoke, and he's in favor of countering violent extremism. But as you know, you and I will discuss with Muniza later, in some of the other areas, it comes to be of a more inclusive countering violent extremism to include hate groups, then that seems more fair. And instead of undermining, right, or ending programs of oppression like CVE, we just say, well, we'll expand a program that was created. Obviously, if you read all of the CVE frameworks, they target Somali communities and Muslim communities. And then also the grant applications for the CVE funding do the same exact thing. So the program was clearly set up for Muslims, and then they said, well, it's part of the resistance. I've been at a meeting where this was also brought up, that if we say, well, you're targeting only Muslims, then they can say, well, we'll be more inclusive and target more people. But I don't think we can logically say under Trump that hate hasn't expanded or come out more in the streets, and that groups that have even driven, vehicles into protesters that were Black Lives Matter protesters or protesting on behalf of George Floyd have faced any severe, prosecution. But to go back to this Strong Cities Network, it is also a subsidiary of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And that's something that you and I were going to discuss further. And so I'll end that part there, and then we can move on to Institute for Strategic Dialogue when you're ready.
Sure, thank you. So I guess what we really want to find out is from you both is what are the ways that CVE institutionally operates within the US? You know, like give us, I mean, obviously Paula's gone through some of that already, but there's two elements to this, right? There's the kind of the funding pots and the programs that are run by the Department of Homeland Security, which of course was created in the context of the war on terror. Like, I think that's quite interesting that we sometimes forget about that. So, you know, in terms of the structure of how it operates, I think it's important we understand that. I think it would be important for you guys to place it within the context of you know, the Department of Homeland Security and what its ultimate aims and goals are. But also, if you could, if I'm adding, can I add a third thing to this for you to respond to, is as a discourse. So separating CVE from a funding pot and a DHS initiated campaign to a typology that could exist outside of those particular frames. If you understand what I'm asking there. So maybe in Minisa, you can start off with that this time.
Sure. So, I mean, as you mentioned, CVE grants are awarded from the Department of Homeland Security to nonprofit organizations, to cities and other bodies. And CVE is in large part structured with public-private partnerships. So oftentimes you'll hear, you know, Muslim organizations say that we've participated in CVE, but not government CVE, which is, you know, it's not a coherent kind of explanation. But I'll leave the technical details of DHS and CVE to the expert. But I did want to make a note about how you're right. So while actual CVE programs and CVE grants are not always in operation, you know, many of us have actually internalized the lens of counter-extremism and the security state. And so we police our own and each other's speech. And I even read the other day that, you know, our dear brother Maurice Salakan, who is the biggest advocate for political prisoners, he's had the police called on him while advocating for our prisoners at mosques and other Muslim events. And, you know, even recently we saw how the chief of police was invited to Yasser Qadi's mosque in Texas in the midst of, you know, a national uprising against police violence. So even when formal CVE on paper isn't in place, we replicate the logic of CVE amongst ourselves.
Paula, sorry, I wanted to invite you to speak about.
Oh, yes. So, you know, in regards to our article where we mentioned Minnesota's Office of Violence Prevention, right? They use the community-focused public health approach, right, to ensure that everyone is free from violence. And it reeks of countering violent extremism, even though, you know, it's not called CVE, which again, I think propelled us to write this article. It's created to break the cycle of violence, it says, by addressing 3 points: preventing it before it begins, intervening at the first sign of risk, and healing after it happens. And so it's much like CVE's prevention, where you go into that pre-crime space, right, to divert people. And then you can intervene, right, in off-ramps, which is CVE, you know, language for getting people to move away from violence. And in this, you know, they call it, you know, healing, right? But in CVE, it's reintegration, where they, you know, after they rehabilitate and they move to reintegrate people back into society. And Sasha Cotton is the director of the city's Office on Violence Prevention. And she was saying that they that they have that they're looking for gang members, much like we in CVE have, you know, sometimes gang members, but also some organizations use returnees or formers, you know, former people who are radicalized, right, to talk people like off the edge. And so in this particular thing, they want to use gang members who can, in a new City Back initiative. I mean, I just read this article this morning, but it was from August 9th, 2020, that they are moving to put teams of unarmed civilians on the streets for the purpose of engagement and de-escalation. And they were saying that they're recruiting and training community responders to get them out on the street this month in August, not to replace the police, but they used an example: if there's a large congregation of youth on a corner or park, rather than calling the police for suspicious activity, they could send out one of these groups to find out what's going on and engage with them. So this is one way that I think, without being directly CVE, we can see CVE as a kind of framework, just without maybe not government funding and maybe not called countering violent extremism, how this form has just taken hold, you know, in the counter-terror state.
That's great. And if I can just stay with you, Paula, for a little while, because here in the UK, we have an interesting phenomenon that takes place in relation to funding. I do want to understand funding a bit better in the US, because I'm a little bit unclear about where it comes from and where elements of coercion might factor. So, for example, here in the UK, Dr. Fahad Qureshi, no relation, but he's a wonderful scholar, has done a really brilliant piece where he interviews a number of people who work in kind of various NGO spaces that deal with the very real problems that we have in the UK relating to alcohol abuse, drug abuse, various forms of social ills. And what he shows through the course of his research is that these organizations traditionally got funding from the government to carry out this very necessary work. You know, in a way, it's supposed to help try and ease off pressure from the NHS by having these kinds of outfits that will do these types of interventions. But what they did is that they, especially, well, particularly for the ones that were Muslim and focused on Muslims, they removed their funding and said, if you want further funding, you can now gain it through this pot called Prevent. But in order to gain the funding from that pot to carry on your work, you also have to include de-radicalization as an aspect of your work. And so you see the way in which those members of the community who might want to do the right thing by people who are suffering on a daily basis might feel that element of coercion to get involved in these types of programs, because they feel like, well, if we don't bring this work into our own, we're not going to get the funding we need in order to help the people that we've been helping for so long. Like, you know, for those of us who work with vulnerable people, you know, they're always at the front of your mind. Even when you go home, like, you never forget about them, you never forget about their stories. So it's a really nasty trick that unfortunately the government has played here in the UK. And I'm just wondering how that looks in the US. Is it as nefarious as it is over here, or is there something more, there's something a little bit different going on?
Well, I'm not speaking, you know, from the non-profit sector, because I've not been involved in that. And I've always just been in the role of an academic and critical of countering violent extremism. But I do know that, as I read earlier, there are efforts to fund, you know, public-private partnerships. I do know that social media entities such as Google and Facebook and Twitter are involved in countering violent extremism, especially online, as we are discussing right now on the ground countering violent extremism, but we haven't touched on CVE online, which I know UK has a big part of that as well. I do know that also, you know, we had the Obama era where NGOs or nonprofits could compete for funding and do CVE programs. And then Trump came and ended that per se as it was, and redirected funds primarily to law enforcement agencies and police departments, though some organizations did receive funds, and those are available, you know, online to read. Also, Brennan Center kind of made notes of some of those, broken down by city. And one thing that I appreciated they did was include pass-through organizations. So if the money was going to pass through organizations, because again, as you mentioned, you know, the name CVE and government funding, sometimes when I make a critique of something, somebody says, yeah, but the funding, no, it's not about the funding. You know, as Muniza said earlier, there's this like prototype and this almost like you know, we've self-adapted to this kind of a thing. So we have to look at what, like, if you study CVE, you can smell it. When you see it, you know, that's exactly what it is. And so this is just one of the things with the pass-through organizations. And then after Trump, you know, he just started again the DHS, you know, funding pot, and he redirected his violence prevention program / CVE to be way more inclusive and way more broad, you know, which is expected, to bring in other identity or racial extremists. And basically yesterday on YouTube, I saw one of the Trump ads had a number. You would text the word extremist, the word radical, and the word left. So we can see this very COINTELPRO McCarthy, you know, growth of just like, why would you text those things, and what people are you targeting under these very dangerous labels, right? That are, as you said, linked to war on terror. So are we moving outside of like the legal judicial system into this like war, you know, kind of, these things where our legal system aren't going to protect Americans anymore because of secret evidence, or, you know, like material support, or all of these things, which we know have already happened, but are we broadening this net, you know? And so he did begin that funding, but I just wanted to say, and again, the applications went in April, so we don't know who have applied yet, and we don't know if we will, and we haven't been able to read, you know, the applications. A lot of times they are posted. I have seen some that were not successful in the past getting funding, and I have read through some that are, and it's a pretty big list. But one of the things that happened in the interim was that after people were saying, oh, CVE and DHS funding, they began to move to Office of Emergency Services in California, and I can speak to that. That is where a portion of CVE funds were granted out to a variety of organizations. And so they changed offices, and they kind of revamped the names, or they changed from, you know, to a public health approach. You know, although there are some programs like in Minnesota, from the beginning, it did involve mental health professionals. There is, you know, a switch to the public health approach. And again, it seems helpful. It doesn't seem harmful. You always want to help the public. You always want to help communities be helpful. You want to deliver service instead of, you know, the police, but we don't think about the way those services surveil or police, or, you know, as some articles have pointed out, the problems in psychiatry from the beginning against people of color, and the way that they oppress and pathologize and harm. And so that's pretty much what I want to say on that. Do you have some?
I think that's funny. Maybe we can move on to the next question. Austin, you're muted.
Yes, there we go. So yeah, I mean, we have some time, so inshallah we can maybe circle back to some of these conversations. I want to read a passage from your piece, so hopefully you'll recall it. You guys write, unlike a criminal justice approach, basing violence prevention efforts in mental health and education approaches offers significant promise in building community participation and buy-in. You know, for me, that was quite a crucial point in your piece, because, you know, the question is that's often presented, right, is what's the alternative? You know, it's an accusation that I receive a lot from people who are involved in Prevent or CVE in different ways. They say, well, hold on a second, what we're doing sits outside of policing, where we're trying to stop these people from going to prison. But what Paula said, when she mentioned Google and all of these kinds of outfits, it reminded me a little bit. It reminds me a little bit of the danger, I guess, of this type of thinking. Because if you take, for example, the discourse of Muslims on Twitter, just as an example, where you have people accusing others of being like too SJW, or being Khawarij, or being this, that, and the other. These labels, when they come through the lens of CVE, then become weaponized. So it becomes a method by which you can actually harm a political opponent by making an accusation. So if you're texting, if somebody, say for example, says something about, I don't know, Bernie Sanders, for example, as a Muslim, and their support for him or whatever, right? Just as an example. And somebody texts like left and radical or whatever, then what is the consequence on the other side of that for that person? How is an intervention in their life, what does that look like? Because, what we're talking about isn't just the violence of the referral, it's everything that then happens after that. And I think people, they often, they miss that there is a whole series of violent encounters with the state that happen on the other side of an accusation. And because the accusations are made by those who have their own biases, what we're effectively saying is it's a free-for-all. Because in societies that are very polarized in their views, and America is one such society, where you have far right, where you have accusations against the left, where you have all of this happening, right? Then what you'll find is that, of course, some people will be targeted more, because who do you refer to? Does that person that the referral goes to, are they somebody who is critical about these types of words? Like if they receive the word far right and they're looking at him like, oh, no, calling somebody the N-word isn't an indication of far right at all, because it's just a word that some people say because they have their own racist tendencies, right? Then they might ignore it completely, and therefore the whole system breaks down based on our individual prejudices. And that's why when I was thinking about what you've written here, it just, I guess, it made me quite concerned about how this then leads into like a public safety approach, when we are saying, as doctors, teachers, lecturers, we put it in your hands to make these types of determinations. And what does that do to our society when we do that? Nisa, maybe you can share some words about that, please.
Sure. I mean, people have discussed ad nauseum this dichotomy between the good Muslim and bad Muslim, right? In which having criticisms of the status quo renders you a kind of enemy of the state. And obviously this has a stifling effect on how Muslims are able to express themselves. But if we look at examples of the UK, which I want to back up a bit and explain, the UK is very instructive for those of us in the US, because CVE, as we know it here, was based off of Prevent, UK's Prevent. It provided the blueprint for CVE, which was exported. So I wanted to emphasize that, because in the UK, actually, you can be punished for certain forms of speech in ways that work a little bit more insidiously in the United States. So in the UK in particular, we saw, the 22 radicalization risk factors with which people who are, not trained at all or don't understand things about Muslims necessarily even, right? They'll misunderstand, a shirt about one of the companions of the Prophet and interpret it to be, a shirt championing terrorism. So we see the same kind of logic too applied in different contexts. So in the UK with the so-called knife crime crisis, we see the rise of very similar forms of policing where young Black men are being targeted based on the kind of music they listen to or their posts on social media and basically fed to the state as a result. And as you mentioned, the way we evaluate things like this is very is racialized, and it's prejudiced in more ways than one. And it's particularly important, I think, to point out these connections because sometimes in conversations about abolishing the police or CVE, we don't draw the connections between forms of policing that focus on Black bodies and those of non-Black Muslims. So here we see, with designations like Black identity extremism or forms of predictive policing that we discussed in the article in Minneapolis or in the UK, methods that are being used to solve the knife crime crisis. Increasingly, a distinctly post 9/11 logic is being extended to kind of new populations. And it's particularly troubling right now because we've seen the three pilot cities, the three CVE pilot cities or CVE laboratories that was mentioned earlier. They came out so forcefully after George Floyd's murder, declaring racism a public health crisis. And at first, this sounds, like an important declaration to make. Racism is a problem. But if you've been following, how extremism has been described as a public health crisis and how this invited all kinds of state interventions upon regular people, this should raise concerns, especially because we're seeing increasingly how the FBI is being deployed to monitor those who are fighting racism. So even though the state describes racism as a public health crisis, this securitized language alone opens up the floodgates for all kinds of policing.
So, I mean, that's exactly my feelings, about the US as a non-expert. When you see it from afar, you kind of get that sense. And it's interesting because Hafsa just asked a question, Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal, about the way in which our own anxieties are preyed upon is something that I wanted to raise with you, because over here we have the same thing, that the police come along and say, hey, look, you guys need to be worried about the far right. Your mosques might get attacked. So, we've got a pot of funding where you can put in surveillance equipment. You can, in order to, kind of keep safe, you can put in gates, you can do all of these things. We'll help to pay for upgrades to your masjid in order to, or your community center, in order for you to stay safe. But of course, the consequence of that is potentially that relations with the police are then normalized, where it becomes almost like a savior relationship, where they are seen as your protectors, all the while, of course, they are harming other lives. So, how does that fit in to the CVE discussion in particular? Because it's framed in a very different way, and we have that same thing over here. So over here, it's not technically within CVE or prevent funding that this type of relationship takes place. So yeah, I just wondered what your thoughts were about that too. I don't know, Paula, if you want to go first, or who feels more confident, take that on.
So this fortification grant is an issue that I've taken up. It really upsets me. And in California, actually, the CVE grant application and the fortification of houses of worship, whatever it is technically called, were together under like a FEMA emergency services in their preparedness. And people were arguing, well, it has nothing to do with countering violent extremism, though if you look back in the older documents, some CVE funds could go through this. Then over time, if you compare the papers, that sentence was expunged, and perhaps they found a new route for it. But as you said, one of my contentions were, why do we get mosques and Islamic centers involved in relations in disaster preparedness? Not saying that we all don't need to be prepared, right? But we know what urban shield and paramilitary training things these are. And so they bring together your community with these carceral institution, with police, and also these fortification funds are targeted in areas only that meet the goals or the interests of the United States that happen to be near something that they want to protect, like a nuclear reactor or a university or whatever is important to them. It's not like it goes into the community to help you. I've always been skeptical. I do know some places said, look, we need a fence in the back. You know, it's $40,000 and then like a security camera. And so we're just going to apply. I mean, I've been in contact with one man who worked at an Islamic school, and he was very upset about that. And people around the California community have been asking, like, what becomes of this? And people say, well, it's not CVE, so it's fine. I do know that a letter, I think from CARE, about the new program was a little bit more obvious in its invasiveness. And so I think some advice went out to be resistant to that. But again, that's been a concern of mine. Also, where does the surveillance go? I do know that, you know, that you do have to save these things for like 3 years. And then what comes after? Like if they're surveilling your parking lots, you know, through your live surveillance cameras, or, you know, why do we need to fortify certain neighborhoods anyway? I think of the militarization of poorer neighborhoods. And then somebody from CARE San Diego also wrote an article about there were some street lights installed, and he was tracking the street lights that were installed that surveilled, and he found one outside of the different mosques. So we really need to start thinking about, you know, the ways that these other forms of surveilling Muslim communities, instead of just being like, oh, there's no CVE funding. Well, the document doesn't say CVE, so it can't be that. And really like listen to your advocates who are using the time. But as you said, I know people are hungry for funds to provide services. I know, given the, you know, shootings and the hate crimes that happen at mosques, it can be very dangerous. But this is also dangerous.
I mean, I guess that's the point, right? Like, even though it's not technically called CVE, this kind of fortification grant, how should we as Muslim communities think about, you know, the roles that we play, our connection to communities, how we look as a community that sits alongside so many others that are over policed, right? Like where does this interaction then sit in relation to everything else that's going on? Because in some ways it doesn't look good, in other ways it's extremely important. But are there models of us, you know, kind of building this type of protection for ourselves outside of these grants, perhaps?
Before moving on, though, I don't think we really addressed Hafsa's question, which to me seemed more about, for example, politicians or figures in the Muslim community with histories of proximity to actual CVE, but framing that participation as subversive, right? So our CVE application called for greater monitoring of white supremacists. And I think while this logic sounds very promising, it's dangerous in the sense that it lends what's essentially a racist policy a colorblind appearance. And in this sense, it actually renders CVE more robust. And this framing of oneself as kind of an unwilling participant doesn't really change the impact that CVE actually has on our communities. And so in this sense, when we talk about sort of reforming CVE or changing it from within, what we're really saying is that we're making CVE more vibrant, more complex, and concealing the violence that it actually inflicts. I just wanted to clarify that before we move on.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean that's a really important point. It kind of like actually I think answered where I was trying to go with this. There is another aspect to all of this, right, which is to do with the ways in which we're profiled. Again, right now in the UK, we're having a huge conversation around algorithms because our students who are doing their GCSEs, which is, I don't know what the equivalent is in America, but it's what you get when you're 16. And then, you know, A-level students is what you get when you're 18, right? But that they weren't able to take their exams. And so an algorithm was used in order to figure out what kind of grade that they should get. The thing about this algorithm, which of course we don't know the details of exactly what went into it, but what it did do is that it effectively downgraded those who are from lower socioeconomic areas, because what they wanted to do is to keep a consistency in their minds about where people came from and the kind of grades that they would normally get. So of course, this fed into kind of class stereotypes, racial stereotypes, all sorts. And I think we don't sometimes pay enough attention to the problem to do with profiling through algorithms. And of course, profiling, you know, has huge significance in the US because right from the whole period of zoning till the present day, where you now have AI doing that zoning effectively, whether it's for insurance companies or whatever it might be, you know, to what extent should we be worried about how algorithms are used within the world of CVE in the States?
Sure. Yeah, so I think this is why in our article we discussed some of the cases in Minneapolis where you know, seemingly colorblind technologies actually functioned to funnel largely young Black men into juvenile detention. And based on things like, you know, their zip code, their racial background, maybe a history of truancy, family income, you know, all of these factors were sort of, you know, to simplify, like thrown into the equation, and you were kind of determined to be at risk or not. This is similar to what we were discussing earlier about the gangs matrix in the UK. Basically, one is labeled, you know, one of three colors, I believe, like amber, green, something like that. And that actually, that label sticks with you the rest of your life. And it's not a neutral kind of labeling. It actually shapes your outcomes too. So I think there is a tendency to understand these like sort of forms of policing as neutral, but they actually produce like new forms of injustice.
Absolutely, they do. We're running out of times, and there were still a couple of areas that I wanted to go through, so we might just extend by a few minutes if that's okay. I guess, you know, building from that, we know the problem of racism in the US, and, you know, there's now enough critical scholarship around the war on terror for us to understand how these two things are linked, are interdependent in many ways. They build off one another, and how CVE fits into that. You know, still perhaps the view on CVE isn't as sophisticated yet as it could be, and I think, you know, you guys are extremely important in the fight to making sure that people understand and are aware of its insidiousness. But in terms of politically, Paula, are there any Muslim politicians, perhaps, or any politicians of any variety, actually, who are taking this issue particularly seriously, who understand the problematics that are associated with it, who understand that it needs to be challenged? Like, you know, is there anyone that you guys can really turn to in order to push back against this type of program?
I tend to find that politicians tend to be on board with CVE. No one's coming to my mind of somebody who would be pushing back against it. As I mentioned with Congressman Keith Ellis, well, when he was a congressman, you know, he would take the stand and say, well, you should not be profiling only Muslims and picking, you know, Islam and Muslims out for these kind of preventions or interventions. But he was not, again, he was not for ending these programs, right? And so it's kind of this like progressive, or as I saw on the Cage website, there was a document about CCE, right? And your countering violent extremism, I guess, committees, but it's in that same vein, right? Where we'll just grow it, as Muniz has said, right? We'll spread it out. We're inclusive, we're liberal, we're progressive, you know, and not ending the program. I don't mean to leave anyone out, but no one comes to my mind. Does anyone come to your mind who's advocating on behalf of CVE?
No, I think the main point that needs to be made is that, you know, any semblance of concern that we see in the sphere of electoral politics about CVE is merely a reflection of how hard the rest of us are pushing against racist policies, right? We can force them to take those positions, but that depends on us and how much faith we actually have in that avenue of creating substantive or meaningful change.
I mean, I'm going to take this question now that was shared on Facebook from Tara. She, you know, she's asking, what type of advice would you give Muslim organizations who work with officials in order to fight this program? You know, because I guess some leadership is required here, you know, but Muslim organizations, they often need to be helped to understand, you know, what the right approach is and what, you know, perhaps an alternative approach might be. Yeah, I'll talk about Cage's approach maybe after, but let me hear from both of you first about on this subject.
I would say try to find alternative funding if the funding is the reason. I know that it can be, you know, stripped in some areas and very difficult. I also know that there are disparities in America between communities. We have some very rich communities and some very poor communities. You know, we have Google Mosques where Google executives go and you could raise millions of dollars. And we have mosques in Oakland that have prisoners, former prisoners, who just want, you know, some lawn mowing equipment and a few items to, you know, mow lawns to make money to get by. I wish that the two could communicate together, and instead of having mega mosques or mega things that services and things that other communities need, you know, can be met. My only thing is, again, my position is to critique and to offer advice from what I know. I leave it up to the communities. You know, also I take it serious that, you know, as a white person who doesn't suffer directly from these harmful profiling, you know, things, my community, you know, does suffer, and that's where I am concerned. But I can't tell communities all across the United States, especially Muslim communities, because they're all very different. Well, this is what you should do. It would be very difficult, and I also find overstepping, right? And I would find it to be very callous. But what I can share are my concerns, the things that I find, the way that it works, and try to offer advice so that they can make the best informed decisions for themselves. I had a UK imam even ask me once, like, what do you suggest? And I said, I suggest you going back to your community and speaking together about how you can move forward in this way. I wish I had, you know, the magic answer, but I don't.
Yeah, I think that as far as greater awareness in the Muslim community goes, I think there needs to be a lot of reframing. So, for example, in many of our internal conversations, there's this understanding that, for example, organizing people on the left is, of course, haram for XYZ reasons, but CVE and participating in CVE is, an ijtihadi issue. And I think this kind of framing is based on fundamental misunderstanding of what CVE proper, but also the logic of CVE more broadly actually does. Because, if we're going to, center Islam and religious practice, programs like CVE are fundamentally reshaping, how we understand our religious tradition in the first place. So these are matters of religious practice. It's not, a political issue that can somehow be separated from the ways that we inhabit Islam in our everyday lives.
No, that's absolutely perfect. I mean, that's exactly how I guess we view things as well. In Cage, we published a report called Beyond Prevent, which of course you could say beyond CVE as well, where effectively what we're saying is that you can't think about preventing crime without removing all of the structural inequalities that exist within society. So you don't say, well, we need to prevent radicalization through mental health services. What you need is adequate mental health services for society at large. You need an adequate education system. You don't need teachers who are trained to spot the signs of radicalization. You need an education system that provides an equal standard of education for all students, right? There are predicates within society that we don't want to do the hard work to fix, but rather get involved in programs that effectively securitize our own communities ultimately, because that seems like the easy thing to do. Because ultimately, we're also scared of the police ourselves. Whether or not people say it, in all of this interaction and all of this engagement that's happening with the police the whole time, at the back of the mind of the Muslim who's engaging is also this fear that I am trying to engage with you, but I recognize that I'm simultaneously subject to the logic of your racist profiling as well. And so actually there is a dialectic that is quite traumatic, that is a constant feature of our engagement. When we engage in a system of violence that the vast majority of our community is subject to, that violence never leaves the back of our mind. And that is why I think, CVE in particular is so problematic and it's so troubling, and especially when we as communities engage with it. Because effectively what we're saying is that we understand that this is harmful, but it is a harm that we're willing to take on because we feel like we can manage it for ourselves. But, just even from a theological perspective, what is the consequence of that when an individual is harmed on the other end of our engagement, right? And I don't think that question is asked often enough, just purely as Muslims, as people who are connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as people who have an afterlife that we have to worry about, that when we're making these so-called decisions about how to go into survival mode, how to have longevity of our organizations, that we're not thinking about the longevity of our soul at the same time. We're just thinking about the longevity of our institution or our da'wah or our jama'ah. And that's often at the exclusion of those who exist outside of that. And so I think that, this conversation, really actually brought those thoughts and those feelings home to me, because it seems that we have a very long way to go. We've already run 10 minutes over the time that we were allotted. I do want a final word from both of you, please, on this new future CVE that's called Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, TVTP, because that is a new phenomenon that's emerged. What can you tell our audience about that? What are the things that we need to look out for? And then inshallah, we'll hopefully end there.
Sure. We don't know that much about it. the DHS created this Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention last year, and many people are just calling it CVE 2.0. The application deadline for the most recent grant program was in June, but we don't know who the grants were awarded to. And I think my mother-in-law can say more about that, but in short, I think there's an interesting focus on racial extremism now that I think is more prominent than it was before. And of course, this is a response to many of the anti-racist uprisings we've seen, and as far back as the murder of Oscar Grant in 2009, but of course more intensely, in 2014, 15 when we saw Ferguson in Baltimore. So increasingly, we're seeing this convergence of CVE type logic and pre-existing forms of anti-Black policing. So that's something that I think we should definitely monitor and be very vigilant about.
Well, I find it very interesting that this came out right before the US presidential election. And for example, if Trump is elected, we see what his plan is going forward. Although, as Muniz has said, it's very vague. And it does target people rising up for social justice. And I'm sure it will also, we saw Blackwater type police come out in some of the northern states from us, Oregon, I believe. And Washington also had, issues with as well, beyond just the regular rank and file police we think of. And my other thing is Biden and Harris are also pro-CVE. And if they are elected to office, I feel like we'll be living the Obama era all over again. In some ways, I am more content when Muslims don't participate in securitizing themselves. And I don't necessarily think it's easier to fight the state from outside, but I feel like when you're trying to fight inside and your own people are telling you, oh, we agree with this program and countering violent extremism, and then your organizations are making money off capitalizing on the people. When you read CVE documents over and over and over again, you find that these programs will be a no-go if there's not any insiders willing to make them go. And so my fear is if Biden and Harris, by the way, Kamala Harris was the Attorney General in charge of California. When CVE under Obama, she was in charge of administering it in the state. And she has been very clear that she agrees with CVE and wants to expand it. So I don't, and we did see a lot of Muslim people when Trump came in and people are like, oh, Trump, he's so bad, jump ship like they never were involved in CVE before, or that was the good CVE and this is the bad CVE. So my fear is that, we'll go back to CVE 2.0. Muslims are definitely, at least online in my circles, pushing for the Biden-Harris ticket. So I just feel that the program has been maybe taken another direction, perhaps we don't know about, but it hasn't been as involved in partnership with Muslim communities. So I do fear that it's the expansion, because we knew Muslims are an easy and allowable target. I think Edward Said said, we're the last bastion, Arabs and Muslims, that it's okay to beat up, right? Where you can't get away with saying things with other groups of people, you can with Muslims. And so my concern is just the scope is widening and will take in a lot more people. And that's something that Americans should be very, very concerned about overall.
Jazakumullah khair to you both. This was really informative for me. I definitely learned a lot, as I always do from you. There are so many interconnections between our experiences that I think it's more important than ever that the UK and the US in particular are talking to one another, because I think there's so much cross-fertilization of policy and many aspects of the global war on terror. I think this video will be available for others, so please do share it on Facebook and on your social media more generally. again, please support the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. It's an amazing organization that does such unique work. They need as much assistance as you can give them, as much as possible. We've got another program next week, inshallah, which is going to be amazing. You've got Dr. Samuel Arian, you have Madhuri Salikan, and you also have Dr. Fawzia Siddiqui, the sister of Dr. Afia Siddiqui, who of course is a political prisoner in the US, who was given 86 years for not even hurting another person. You know, that's if you even believe the FBI's indictment of her in the first place, which is, you know, when you read it, it just reads like fiction, really. So, you know, do support them, do attend the events, and inshallah, I hope that I can be with you all again soon. You know, jazakumullah khair to my two wonderful speakers today, and inshallah we'll see each other. Jazakumullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.